Hey, you see this? Corner office, corner suit, corner attitude. You know what we call that around here? A diversity hire with a briefcase? The man laughed. His name was Gideon Marsh, and he had been the regional director of Pinnacle Financial Group Southeastern Division for 11 years. The man he was talking about was standing 40 feet away, waiting for the elevator, not hearing a word of it, or so Marsh assumed. The other man's name was Solomon Tate. He was 38 years old. He was wearing a gray suit that had cost him $600, which was more than Marsh's, though Marsh would never have believed that. He carried a leather folio under one arm and a cup of coffee in his other hand, and he was, by every objective measure in the building, the most qualified person in the room. Marsh didn't know that. Marsh had decided what Solomon Tate was the moment he walked through the door, and no credential on earth was going to change his mind. That decision, made in the lobby of a mid-rise office building in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a Wednesday morning in March, was going to cost Gideon Marsh everything he had spent 11 years building. He just didn't know it yet. Pinnacle Financial Group occupied floors 14 to 19 of the Meridian Tower on South Tryon Street. They managed institutional investment portfolios, municipal pension funds, and private wealth accounts for clients across the Southeast. On paper, they were one of the most respected mid-sized firms in the region. 47 employees, 12 portfolio managers, 3 regional directors, a client base that included 4 city pension funds, 2 university endowments, and a roster of private clients with a combined net worth north of $2 billion. Gideon Marsh ran the Southeast Division. Had since the previous director retired, and Marsh, who had been with the company 9 years at that point, stepped into the role like he had been born for it. And maybe he had, in the sense that he was loud and confident and knew how to work a room. He remembered names, told the right jokes at the right dinners, and never missed a quarterly target by enough to matter. He was, by the metrics the company used, a success. His team liked him, or said they did. His superiors trusted him, or appeared to. His clients knew his name, which in that business is most of what you need. But here's what the quarterly reports didn't show. Gideon Marsh had a way of running his division that had nothing to do with the metrics. He hired certain people and not others, and the pattern wasn't hard to see if you were willing to look. In 11 years, he had promoted 7 people to senior portfolio manager. All 7 were white men. In 11 years, he had terminated or pushed out 19 people. Of those, 14 were Black or Latino. He had a phrase he used in team meetings when discussing underperforming accounts. He called it dead weight, and the accounts he called dead weight had a pattern too. Nobody had written it down. Nobody had kept a notebook. That was the problem. Andre Pemberton had kept receipts, though, literally and figuratively. Andre was a compliance analyst who had been with Pinnacle for 3 years before Marsh arrived. He'd watched the turnover happen in real time. Every quarter, someone gone. Every quarter, the explanation was the same. Performance issues, cultural fit, a restructuring of priorities. The language was always clean and HR approved and utterly devoid of anything you could take to a lawyer. Andre had started keeping a document on his personal laptop. Dates, names, stated reasons for departure, demographics, 3 years of data. He hadn't shown it to anyone. He didn't know what to do with it yet, and more than that, he was afraid. Marsh had a way of making you feel like the walls had ears, like loyalty was the price of survival. Andre paid that price for 3 years. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. What he was really waiting for was the right person. Solomon Tate arrived on a Wednesday in March. He was not, as Marsh had assumed from the lobby, a new hire. He was not a consultant, not a candidate, not a visiting client from a smaller firm. His name was on no internal memo that had been distributed to Marsh's team. He had been brought in quietly, at the request of Pinnacle's parent company, Meridian Capital Holdings, which had grown increasingly concerned over the past 18 months about irregularities in the Southeast Division's compliance reporting. Numbers that didn't reconcile, documentation that was incomplete, client accounts where fees had been assessed in ways that were technically permissible but were being monitored very closely by the SEC's examination unit. The kind of irregularities that, if they turned into a formal inquiry, would cost the company more than money. Solomon Tate was Meridian Capital's chief regulatory officer. He had a law degree from Yale and a master's in financial economics from the University of Chicago. He had spent 11 years as a senior examiner at the SEC before Meridian recruited him. He had been responsible in that role for two of the largest enforcement actions against regional wealth management firms in the past decade. He knew how these firms worked. He knew where they hid things. He knew which documents to ask for and which questions to ask second, not first, because the second question was the one that caught people unprepared. He had asked his assistant to book him on an early flight from New York. He had asked for a rental car, nothing conspicuous, and a hotel 3 blocks from the office. He had told no one at the Charlotte office he was coming. He arrived, parked, walked in through the lobby, pressed the button for floor 17, and stood waiting for the elevator with a cup of coffee. That was when Gideon Marsh walked past, speaking to a subordinate named Kyle, and said the thing about the briefcase and the diversity hire. Solomon heard it. He didn't turn around. He stepped into the elevator when it arrived, pressed 17, and watched the doors close. The receptionist on 17 did not know who he was. She asked if he had an appointment. He said he was there to see the CFO, gave his name, and waited. She picked up the phone. 30 seconds later, the CFO, a woman named Patricia Lund, appeared in the hallway with an expression on her face that was trying very hard not to look alarmed. She shook his hand, led him to a conference room, closed the door. For the next 4 hours, Solomon Tate sat at that table and did not raise his voice once. He asked for files. He got files. He asked for access to the reporting system. He got access. He asked for the documentation on 16 client accounts, cross-referenced with the fee assessment logs from the past 30 months. He got those too. He worked through lunch. He didn't ask for anything except water and occasionally a different set of files. Patricia Lund sat at the corner of the table for most of it, answering questions when asked, watching him work, and trying to understand how worried she should be. Pretty worried, it turned out. Meanwhile, on floor 16, Gideon Marsh was in his own office having a different kind of morning. He had gotten a call from an assistant on 17 telling him that someone from corporate was in the building doing a compliance review. He had been given no name, no scope, no timeline, just someone from corporate, compliance, conference room B, do not disturb. Marsh had sat with that information for about 20 minutes before deciding it was probably a routine audit. They happened twice a year. He had survived 4 of them without a single material finding. He was not worried. He was, in fact, irritated that no one had told him in advance because he was a regional director, and regional directors were supposed to be informed about things like this. He called Patricia Lund's cell. She didn't pick up. He called her assistant. The assistant said she was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. Marsh hung up and decided to go to lunch. He was still at lunch at a steakhouse 2 blocks away when Solomon Tate finished his preliminary review and made a call to the general counsel's office in New York. The call lasted 14 minutes. Nobody in Charlotte knew about it. Andre Pemberton was at his desk on floor 15 when his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown internal extension. It said, "Compliance review underway on 17. If you have documentation relevant to personnel practices, now is the time." A name and a room number, that was all. Andre stared at the message for a long time. Then he opened his laptop, saved the document he had been keeping for 3 years to a flash drive, put the flash drive in his jacket pocket, walked to the elevator, and pressed 17. He knocked on the conference room door. Solomon opened it. Andre said he had some information that might be relevant. Solomon said sit down and closed the door behind him. What Andre laid out over the next 90 minutes was not the kind of thing that comes from one person's bad judgment on one bad day. It was a system. Not written anywhere, never articulated in policy, never put into a memo, but a system nonetheless. A set of practices that had developed over 11 years into something that functioned like a machine for producing a particular outcome. Who got promoted? Who got pushed out? Which accounts got prioritized? Which clients got the senior manager's attention, and which got handed off to whoever was newest? And underneath all of it, a pattern so consistent across so many data points that calling it coincidence would have required a level of credulity that no reasonable person possessed. Solomon looked at Andre's spreadsheet for a long time. Then he asked 3 questions. Were these dates verifiable against HR records? Yes. Were the stated reasons for termination documented in the files? Yes. Was Andre aware that sharing this information made him a potential witness in a regulatory proceeding with all the protections and obligations that entailed? Andre said he was aware. Solomon closed the laptop and said, "Thank you, that was all." That evening, Marsh came back from a team dinner around 8:30, pleasantly full, slightly warm from the wine, entirely confident in how the day had gone. He took the elevator to 16, walked to his office, and found 3 things on his desk that had not been there when he left. A printed notice of a formal compliance review signed by Meridian Capital's general counsel. A list of documents his office was required to produce by 9 the following morning. And a sticky note from Patricia Lund that said simply, "Call me before you talk to anyone." Marsh sat down in his chair and read the document list. 11 years of hiring records, 11 years of termination files, the complete documentation for 42 client accounts, fee assessment logs, internal communications related to personnel decisions, performance review records for every employee who had been terminated or resigned during his tenure. He picked up the phone and called his attorney. The next morning arrived with the particular quiet that comes before something irreversible. Solomon Tate had been at the office since 7. He had requested and received the HR files overnight, transmitted electronically from the main office in New York. He had 2 additional analysts from Meridian's legal team with him now, both of whom had driven up from Atlanta at 6 in the morning. Conference Room B had become something else overnight, not a meeting room. A workspace for something that was already well underway. Gideon Marsh arrived at 8:45. His attorney arrived at 9. They were shown to a different conference room on a different floor and told that Mr. Tate would be with them shortly. Marsh had spent most of the night on the phone. He had talked to his attorney, to his union contact, to 2 colleagues he trusted, to his wife, and to no one who had said anything that made him feel better. His attorney had told him that if the review was proceeding at this pace and scope, it was not routine. His union contact had said the same thing in different words. His wife had asked him questions he didn't have good answers to. Solomon walked into the conference room at 9:17. He sat down across from Marsh and placed a folder on the table, but did not open it. He said, "Mr. Marsh, I'm going to be straightforward with you about where this review stands." He said, "In the past 24 hours, we have identified significant irregularities in the personnel records of your division, going back approximately 9 years. The pattern is consistent across multiple categories of data and is not attributable to performance metrics, seniority, or documented business need." He said, "We have also identified fee assessment irregularities in 14 client accounts that appear to have generated revenue that was not properly disclosed in the applicable client agreements." He placed a single sheet of paper on the table, not the folder, 1 sheet. He said, "This is a summary of what we have documented so far. The review is ongoing. I expect it will expand." Marsh looked at the paper. His attorney put a hand on his arm. Marsh pulled his arm away. He said, "I've managed this division for 11 years. My numbers have been..." Solomon said, "Your revenue numbers have been adequate. That's not what this review is about." Marsh said, "Whatever someone told you, you need to understand that compliance in a regional division involves judgment calls that..." Solomon said, "Mr. Marsh, 19 people left your division under circumstances that are now documented. 14 of them were Black or Latino. 7 people were promoted to senior roles. None of them were Black or Latino. That is not a judgment call. That is a pattern." Marsh's attorney started to speak. Solomon let him finish. Then he said, "We are not here to negotiate today. I'm informing you of the scope of the review and your obligation to cooperate fully. HR will be in contact about the personnel process. If you have questions about the regulatory dimensions, those will need to go through your attorney." He stood up. Marsh looked up at him. For a moment, his face did something complicated, cycling through 3 or 4 things at once. Then he said, "You were in the lobby yesterday morning." Solomon said, "I was." Marsh said nothing for a moment. Then, "I didn't know who you were." Solomon said, "I know." He picked up the folder, closed the conference room door behind him. There is a particular silence that follows a moment like that. Not the silence of a room where nothing is happening, but the silence of a room where everything has already happened and the people in it are only now beginning to understand it. Gideon Marsh sat in that silence for a long time. What came next took 4 months, which is fast for something this size. The formal investigation expanded to include the SEC's examination unit, which had already been monitoring the division and needed little prompting to open a full inquiry. The fee irregularities in the 14 accounts turned out to be 22 accounts, totaling approximately $3.4 million in fees that had been assessed in ways that were impermissible under the client agreements. Not money Marsh had pocketed directly, but revenue that had been generated through practices that misrepresented the fee structure to clients. The kind of thing that looks fine until someone looks at it closely. Solomon had looked closely. The personnel findings were referred to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Andre's documentation, combined with the HR records, produced what the EEOC's investigative team later described as one of the clearest statistical patterns of discriminatory employment practice they had reviewed in a regional financial firm. 14 terminations, 7 promotions, 9 years of data, a demographic disparity that could not be explained by performance or tenure, or any factor other than the one that was staring at the data from every angle. Marsh was placed on administrative leave within the week. His access to systems was revoked. His badge was collected. He left the building through the parking garage, which is what you do when you have 11 years of presence in a place and you do not want to be seen leaving it. His attorney negotiated. The regulatory findings were too well documented to fight, and fighting them would have required Marsh to put his own communications into evidence, which his attorney advised against in terms that were not gentle. He accepted a consent order on the regulatory violations. He agreed to cooperate with the EEOC investigation, which meant sitting across from investigators and answering questions about decisions he had made for 11 years while pretending in the moment that they were about something other than what they were actually about. He was permanently barred from serving in a supervisory or compliance-related role in any SEC-registered firm. His career in financial services was over. Patricia Lund was not terminated. She had been aware of the personnel patterns and had raised concerns internally twice in writing, and had been told both times that the matter had been reviewed and addressed. Those internal communications existed in the record and made her position considerably more defensible than Marsh's. She cooperated fully. She stayed. Andre Pemberton was classified as a cooperating witness. His 3 years of documentation were entered into the EEOC record and credited explicitly in the investigative findings. He was later promoted to Director of Compliance for the Southeast Division, which was restructured entirely over the following year under new leadership. He kept the flash drive in a drawer in his home office, not as a trophy. As a reminder that the right moment sometimes takes 3 years to arrive and you have to be ready when it does. The 19 former employees identified in the investigation were contacted. 11 of them were located and agreed to participate in the remediation process. The remaining 8 had moved on far enough that some could not be reached or chose not to engage. Of the 11, a settlement was reached. Not a public one. The amounts were not disclosed, but every person who sat across the table from Meridian's legal team and told their story was told, formally and on the record, you were wronged. These words were not empty. They were part of the agreement. A man named Leonard Oakes had been terminated from the division 6 years earlier. Marsh had called it a restructuring. Leonard had been a senior portfolio analyst with 8 years of experience and a track record that was, by the division's own metrics, in the top quartile. He had been replaced within 3 months by someone with 4 years of experience. Leonard had tried at the time to find an attorney who would take the case. 2 had told him the evidence wasn't strong enough. 1 had said the pattern existed but couldn't be proven in isolation. He had moved to a different city, taken a position with a smaller firm, rebuilt. When Meridian's legal team called him, he didn't believe it at first. He asked them to send everything in writing. Then he sat with it for a week before he called back. He said during his deposition, "I knew what it was. I knew from the day it happened. I just didn't have the proof. And I learned early that knowing something and being able to prove it are 2 different kinds of lonely." That line was not included in any press release. It was in the transcript. The investigators noted it. A woman named Constance Farrow had been passed over for promotion twice in 4 years before resigning. She had applied to 3 other firms after leaving Pinnacle and been rejected from 2 without explanation. She was working in nonprofit financial management when the EEOC contacted her. She was doing work she found meaningful, but that paid her 60% of what she had earned at Pinnacle. She participated in the settlement process. She did not return to private financial services. When someone asked her later, in an informal conversation, whether the outcome felt like justice, she said, "It felt like being believed." That's not the same thing, but it's not nothing. Meridian Capital, under pressure from its board and from the regulatory findings, overhauled its regional management structure, new hiring protocols, new promotion documentation requirements, mandatory demographic reporting for every personnel decision above a certain threshold, an independent audit of all 6 regional divisions, not just the Southeast. The policies were real. Whether they would hold over time was a different question. The kind of question that doesn't get answered in 4 months or 4 years, but slowly, in the accumulation of small decisions made by people who may or may not be paying attention. Solomon Tate flew back to New York on a Thursday afternoon. His flight was on time. He had a window seat. He read through a different set of files on the way home because there was always a different set of files. That was the job. He had not given any interviews about the Pinnacle matter. He had not made any statements. When someone on the legal team had asked him, informally, whether he was satisfied with the outcome, he had said he thought the documentation was thorough and the remediation was appropriate, given the scope of what was found. The person asking had laughed a little. "Come on," they said. "You heard what that guy said about you in the lobby. Didn't you want him to know who he was talking about?" Solomon had looked at them for a moment. He said, "He found out." He said, "The point was never about me knowing and him not knowing. The point was that 19 people lost jobs. 11 came forward, and the system that let it happen for 11 years is now documented and on record. That's the point." He went back to his files. But here is the thing that is worth sitting with, after all of it. After the investigation and the consent order and the settlements and the restructuring, after Leonard Oakes got the phone call he had stopped waiting for, and Constance Farrow sat in a room where someone finally used the word wronged in her direction. Solomon Tate walked into that lobby because he had a job to do and a flight that left at 6 in the morning. That was it. He wasn't there because someone finally listened to a complaint. He wasn't there because a pattern finally crossed some threshold that made it impossible to ignore. He was there because a parent company had grown nervous about a regulatory exposure, and the most efficient way to manage that exposure was to send someone who knew what to look for. That's not nothing. Results happened. People were held accountable. Records were corrected. But Leonard Oakes had tried to find a lawyer 6 years earlier. Andre Pemberton had kept a document for 3 years and hadn't known who to give it to. Constance Farrow had been passed over twice and left because there was nowhere left to go. 3 people with the same information, in the same building, watching the same pattern, for years. The information was there. The evidence was there. What wasn't there was someone with the standing to make the system pay attention. And the only reason that person showed up at all was because of a spreadsheet in New York that flagged a revenue variance in a regional division. Not because anyone listened. Not because the system worked the way it was supposed to. Because a number on a spreadsheet got noticed and an executive decided to send someone. Take Solomon Tate out of that lobby. Take away the Yale law degree and the 11 years at the SEC and the title on the organizational chart. Put a regular compliance analyst in his place. Someone without the standing to walk into conference room B and ask for 11 years of HR files and actually receive them. What happens to Andre's flash drive? What happens to Leonard Oakes? What happens to the 14 accounts and the 22 fee structures and the 19 people whose departures are now, finally, in a federal record? You already know the answer. The question isn't whether the story ended well. It did. The question is what it required for it to end well, and whether that requirement is something you're willing to call a system. So tell me in the comments, should documentation like Andre's have a formal, protected channel in every company, one that goes directly above the management it's documenting? Should 11 years be the acceptable timeline for a pattern this clear to surface? Where's the line between oversight and luck? Drop your answer below. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We put out stories like this every week because the ones that don't make the news are usually the ones that matter most. I keep coming back to the lobby. That's the part I can't shake. A man walks into a building, presses an elevator button, stands there with a cup of coffee, and someone looks at him and decides, in about 3 seconds, exactly who he is and what he's worth. No resume, no record, no conversation. Just a glance and a verdict. What Gideon Marsh didn't understand, what people like him never understand until it's too late, is that the world has a way of making the accounting come due, not because the universe is watching, not because karma is some invisible force keeping score in the background, but because the choices we make every day build the structure we eventually have to live inside. Marsh built his for 11 years. Every bad hire, every manufactured performance review, every person he pushed out the door with a clean HR-approved explanation. He built it brick by brick and called it a career. What he was actually building was a record, and records have a way of surviving the people who made them. What I find myself thinking about most, though, is not Marsh. It's Andre. 3 years of keeping a document on a personal laptop. 3 years of writing down names and dates and departure reasons that nobody asked him to write down, for a case he couldn't build, for a channel that didn't exist, toward an outcome he had no way of guaranteeing. That is a specific kind of courage that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not the dramatic kind. It's the kind that asks you to do the right thing in the dark, with no audience, no certainty, and no promise that it will ever matter. Andre did it anyway. He just kept the document, and when the moment finally arrived, he was ready. That's something I try to hold on to. Integrity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's the choice you make when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed, and you do it anyway because you know what's right and you know what's being lost if nobody keeps track. Solomon Tate spent 11 years at the SEC learning how to look at a system and understand what it was actually doing beneath what it said it was doing. That kind of knowledge doesn't come fast. It comes from showing up, paying attention, and doing the work even when the work is slow and the results are invisible for a long time. And then one day, you walk into a conference room in Charlotte and you ask for 11 years of HR files, and you know exactly what you're looking at when they arrive. The people who live with the most integrity over time tend to also be the most capable when it matters. Not because they got lucky, because they were building something while they were waiting. Andre was building something. Solomon was building something. Even Leonard Oakes, who spent 6 years rebuilding after a termination that should never have happened, he was building something, even if it didn't feel that way from inside it. What Marsh was building in the end was an 11-year case against himself. He just didn't know anyone would ever read it. I think about Constance Farrow saying it felt like being believed. Not justice exactly, but being believed. I think that's worth more than people realize. And I think it's worth asking ourselves what we are doing right now, in the ordinary moments when no one is checking, to make sure that when someone finally does look, what they find is something we can stand behind.